I got a question on my last video that was really interesting. I am so far off my filming schedule at this point, it's ridiculous, but it's a question a lot of people have, a lot of people ask me, and it's probably more interesting than what I was going to talk about this week anyway. So, here's what happened. Last week I had a few tips for language learners, and when I introduced them, I mentioned it took me a few seconds to remember the word tip in English instead of the word astuce, which is not English. I remembered all of the other words, it was just the tip. But I'm not the only person this happens to. A lot of people talk about forgetting a word in their first language when they've been studying or speaking another language, even if it wasn't super recent. And we've all had that friend who did 2 weeks in Spain over the summer and came back talking like Hilaria Baldwin. So I was asked, what's going on? Why does this happen? It's actually really interesting and related to some fascinating psycholinguistics that tells us more about the language faculty. So stick around and I'll explain what's going on, whether we can do anything about it, and how it relates to ADHD. That's a good hook. It's a good hook. If you don't know me, I've got a PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania. I speak a handful of languages, and I'm an international man of mystery. I'm Dr. Taylor Jones, and this is, Parole. This is Language Jones. First things first, we have to get some terminology out of the way. What we're talking about here isn't really forgetting per se. You'll remember the word later and be able to use it. You haven't wiped the drive. Rather, the technical term, and I'm not even kidding, is tip of the tongue moment. You feel like the word is there, it's just not quite happening. There's a lot of research on how we process language in the brain, and speech processing and speech planning are way too much to get into for just this video. But you should know it's an academic morass with all sorts of competing theories. So when I tell you what I think makes sense, there is strong academic support for it, but it's also not completely settled. Anyway, if you're just a regular old monolingual who's speaking your native language, you still get tip of the tongue moments. The difference is that for many of us, it feels like the word in the language we're learning almost forces out the word we wanted. Before we can get to why, I just want to run down what even happens when we speak. You have to somehow get from a concept to selecting the words that communicate the concept to turning the mental objects of words and syntax you've constructed into instructions for moving your mouth meat and nose holes. Those are not the technical terms. Early theories posited that you think of a concept, then that activates a number of competing lemmas, basically abstract words, sort of before letters and sounds, and definitely by all accounts before you add things like morphological markers. That's plural S, for instance. Then you'd actually select word sounds and arrange them, or arrange the concepts and select the sounds that spell out that structure. In generative syntax, this is actually just called spell out, in all caps. The theory I'm partial to, and which has a lot of academic support, is one where you have cascading activations. So concepts are coming together, but words are already being selected and mapped to actual gestures to produce those sounds, all in a beautiful waterfall like tiered champagne glasses at a wedding. If you're someone who's already speaking before you know how that sentence will end, you'll agree with me on the plausibility of this over-organizing everything on one level at a time and then speaking. Either way, both would be below the level of consciousness and blazing fast. Okay, so what happens when you add a second language in the mix? Well, there's different things that could happen. One is that you map your L1, that's fancy linguist jargon for your first language, to your L2, your second language. So if you're bilingual in English and French like me, maybe you just kind of think in English and adapt it, at least at a word level for concrete items. This is the word-mediated approach. Is it word-mediated? No, WAM is not. Word association model. Okay. This is the word association model. The other option is the concept-mediated approach, where you map concepts to words in both languages. What's cool about this is that they make different predictions about how our brains work, and we can test those predictions with experiments that are potentially as simple as just measuring how long it takes people to translate and/or label things under various conditions. So this is what linguists and psychologists did. There's pretty strong evidence that translation or switching languages is conceptually mediated, meaning it actually takes longer if you're given a word and told to translate it because you don't just go word to word, but you actually think of the thing first. Although that's not quite right. And recent work has found that there's all sorts of asymmetries. So if you give me a word in my L2, let's take koshka, a different L2, I might actually, depending on how I learned it, have that mapped directly to English cat. But if you ask me how to say cat in Russian, I'm likely to actually have to think of a cat on some level before I can generate Koshka. There's all sorts of studies that indicate interesting priming effects, meaning if you've heard or seen something recently, it makes processing related information faster. That's priming. But the cross-linguistic stuff is the weird stuff. If you ask Russian-English bilinguals to perform a task in English, if the words in English are sort of similar to Russian words, they'll activate entire networks of Russian in their brain, activating entire networks of Russian. The classic study on this was an eye tracking study that asked people to click on the marker and found that Russian speakers looked at stamps before clicking on the picture with a marker in it. But English monolinguals didn't. Why? Well, stamp in Russian is marka. The astute among you will notice that they're not pronounced exactly the same. So cascading models of activation actually get some support here because they hear mar and start looking at the stamps, even though the marka and marker aren't pronounced the same. Similar enough, and you get priming. It's also easier to remember words that share sounds and have meaning overlap, even if they're not actually related. This is why I can remember that bizarre is muzar in Hebrew. It's also why I think it's really smart that Duolingo insists on forcing you to do harder mappings. Pretty sure they only give me strange or weird as options for that word. Film in the French course is exclusively translated as movie. Oh, and the even more astute of you will wonder if I was primed to include the word astute in my script because I had the French word astuce activate astute in my mental lexicon while writing this script. We also see some interference effects. So in studies with Dutch-English bilinguals, if you want them to say mountain in their second language, in this case English, say you gave them a picture and said, "What is this?" It can be helped along by either saying a word like mouth in English that shares some sounds, or mau in Dutch. It can also be impeded by saying dal, which means nothing in English, but valley in Dutch, or so I'm told, and is therefore semantically related but the wrong word. But what we want to know is why they might remember mountain when they're speaking Dutch and wanted to say berg. And that's where it gets really interesting. When you know two languages, they're both active in your brain. Listening to your L2 will actually prime words in your L1, so yes, astute, astuce. Similar overlapping brain regions light up when we use our various languages, but they don't overlap completely either. The leading theory on what happens when you speak your L2 is that you actually have to suppress your L1, and vice versa, believe it or not. The thing is, I speak English all the time, and I speak French way less. So when I'm speaking English, it's really generally not hard for me to suppress French. But when I speak French, it takes mental bandwidth to keep speaking French, because it's hard, and it's not my first language, and wouldn't it just be a lot easier to speak English? This leads to what's sometimes called paradoxical suppression. It takes way more energy to suppress your first language. This is not just a metaphor, it's literally exhausting. And that means once you've been doing that for a while, it's also hard to turn off. So the fact that I'd been binge listening to French podcasts a little earlier in the day before writing that last script was enough for me to just be in the habit of suppressing English words. And low frequency words are harder to conjure than high frequency, just normally. And I'd been listening to podcasts that gave tips. So I'd heard the actual word astuce more times recently than the word tip. So as the pretentious friend who now can't recall anything in English because, how you say, I spent a week in Barcelona faking it? Maybe. It's a real phenomenon, but people can also play it up because they want you to think they're interesting and ask them about their vacation and the running of the bulls or whatever. Yeah, I know, wrong city. Leave me a comment with the right city and if they still do that. Okay, but what about that hook at the beginning? ADHD? This is absolutely wild to me. If you think about this suppression I've been talking about, it's interference suppression and response inhibition. These are both subdomains of executive control. If you're at all interested in ADHD, you probably know that it's all about executive control. YouTube's favorite ADHD expert even argues it should be called IDD, intentional deficit disorder, all because of executive control. So does this mean that people with ADHD are not good at language learning? Absolutely not. Although some of the skills might be more difficult. I know I'll be more patient with the ADHDers in my life who just keep on speaking to me in English when I switch for funsies to a language we both speak. It's legit harder to make that switch when it's not necessary or a crisis. This is true of a lot of people and not just those with ADHD, so don't get it twisted. My wife, for instance, had studied French for years but wasn't comfortable speaking it until after I faked a stomach bug in Nice and left her with my very monolingual aunt while I read in the bathroom for a while. Note, this is neither language learning nor relationship advice, and try this at your own peril. Anyway, what's really cool about this is that the research suggests that bilingualism improves executive function. It looks like it might actually be causal and not just a neat relationship, in part because very young children, including native bilinguals, see a benefit in experimental studies of executive function, and some studies seem to suggest an improvement in executive function from studying a foreign language. Although they're not necessarily longitudinal studies, so take them with a grain of salt, and more research is needed, and yada, 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 yada. So what can we do about this forgetting words in our native language? Well, nothing really. It just sort of comes with the territory. The best we can say is that if you develop robust code switching on a very regular basis in all domains like Catalan and Spanish speakers, and this is from an experimental study, you're likely to benefit from priming rather than suffer from it. But for most of us, we're going to have tip of the tongue moments, and for language learners, paradoxically, yes, you can forget words in your native language when you're speaking your native language because it's just too hard to suppress the thing you've been actively trying to develop the ability to activate. So there you have it. If you like what I'm doing with the channel, please like and subscribe and leave me a comment with your favorite linguistic mix-up. It not only helps with the algorithm, but it also just really entertains me. I have a Patreon, so you can support the channel at www.patreon.com or right here on YouTube with super thanks and super chat. If you like this video, watch some of my others. YouTube's whole game is keeping you watching videos on the platform, and therefore ads, and they think you'll like this one. Until next time, Khadafez? Litraot? Bye.